So the background information that I just wanted to share is there are various versions of the word for non-Romani person, or rather non-Romani male, in Romani dialects. In my family's Romani, it's Gadjo. So that's where Gadjology comes from. Two of the basic reasons for anti-Gypsyism are outsider perceptions and misperceptions of Romani groups. I'm sure this is groundbreaking information for all of you. These views are always colored by ideas about a hypothetical mainstream norm set in contrast with more or less artificially homogenized categories of gypsiness. In the background of much research in Romani studies, it seems to me, are two larger questions. Are Roma, or Gypsies, unique? And in which way are they more different from majority cultures or from each other? I would like to summarize some of my work which attempts to complement Romani studies by moving away from the study of Roma altogether. Many authors have already done this in practice by scrutinizing the non-Romani role in interethnic relations and specifically in anti-Gypsyism. Rather than focusing on Roma as victims of injustice, however, I want to explore how the research questions asked by many scholars of Romani people could yield better answers if they were also applied to the wider society through methods I collectively label as Gadjology. Historically, a significant percentage of work on Romani people has been plagued by overgeneralizations, essentialisms, and the simple fact that researchers are expected to find and report on how Roma differ from majority populations, rather than finding and reporting on common ground. The belief in essential differences is especially true among many European authors, and it includes some Romani writers who subscribe to ethno-theories of behavior that are based on suspect majority and minority understandings of cultural determinism and even sometimes genetics. An overall trend in publications on Romanis, too, is to study either musicians, and yes, I am an ethnomusicologist, or the least socially integrated and most exotic subgroups, or both. Granted, very large Romani populations do fall into these categories. However, despite being an important political and representational force, the non-musician Romani middle class is not a popular research subject, and not so many people pay to read about the ways in which many Roma are or wish to be the same as their non-Romani neighbors. I only have time for one example from the literature today, so I will use the work of the Czech anthropologist Marek Jakobek, a review editor for the Romani Studies Journal. Authors such as Jakobek may readily conflate the values and behavior of Roma in the poorest and most socially excluded settlements with those living much different lives in urban areas. Some scholars leave little room for the possibility that within a generation or two, many immigrants make adaptations to life in the new environment. If, rather than perseverating on how hopelessly different Roma are, writers like Jakobek stepped back and looked at their own ethnic groups, they might consider the history of Czechs, Slovaks, and others who made the move from rural, largely unschooled lives to the educated urban societies held up as the standard of their culture today. Minority ethnic identity is held to ongoing scrutiny in both popular and academic discourse that is divergent from the requirements for a recognized majority identity, for example, Czech identity. In order to be ethnically Czech, one need not have any particular characteristics of personality. Some auto-stereotypes do occur, but there is very little consensus on these when compared to the so-called common sense regarding Roma and other minorities. People like Marek Jakobek, who speak of the disconnect between the Romani intelligentsia and the Romani masses, would do well to note the same disconnect in their own groups. For example, Czech opera, experimental theater, and other works of high art are rarely accused of being not really Czech, even if the vast majority of Czechs has never laid eyes on them. No one from within questions a Czech person's Czechness on the basis of any one set of behaviors or preferences. And yet the Czechness, the Europeanness, and the Romness of various Roma is questioned, reified, and discursively manipulated by writers all the time. In order to join other anti-essentialist, non-exoticizing scholars of Roma, and to assist in balancing against some problematic literature, I have taken whiteness. Am I doing that? Sorry. That's the other computer, sorry. I have taken whiteness as a theoretical framework in ways that are both the same and divergent from whiteness studies or critical white studies. These approaches understand whiteness, or majority ethnic groups, to be the unarticulated, unmarked, and unexamined norm, and work to rectify the resulting blind spots in scholarship and popular thinking. My research has gone beyond questions of how white people see and treat minorities. I am actually looking to inspire a related but different sort of debate through the heuristic use of dominant methodologies and theoretical constructs, but with their subject-object positions of research modified or reversed. The original and still strongest impetus for the angle I am taking is Horace Miner's 1956 article, Body Ritual Among the Nasarema, which you have to read if you haven't already, which uses contemporary anthropological perspectives and, notably, anthropological jargon to describe the exotic customs of a tribe, which perceptive readers will identify as Americans spelled backwards, but others will imagine to be an isolated group of natives. This reversal of the ethnographic gaze, also calling to mind the tradition of authors such as Bell Hooks, is meant to provide a view of different ethnic groups and of difference itself that may or may not be more objective than ethnic studies, but certainly aims to be more balanced. Specifically, I take dominant categories and hierarchies that describe cognitive functioning, educational attainment, ethnically marked adaptability to the law, and ideas of culturally determined rational versus magical thinking. And I use them not to assess a minority group's performance or level of integration, but rather to see where certain members of the majority would stand if one applied to them the same standards of difference seeking that dominant subjects apply to subaltern groups. Thus, for example, if we are going to engage in discussions of gypsy crime, then we should also single out not only white-collar crime in general, but country or region-specific misdeeds as well. The aim of Gadjology is to expose some of the logical inconsistencies stemming from academic or journalistic difference-seeking, as well as from people's everyday commentaries about how they diverge from us. When the same question is turned around in the direction of whiteness, its original validity is often weakened. For every question that is a commonly offered stigmatization of a minority, the same thing could be asked about the majority. Question 1. Why can't Romani politicians agree amongst themselves and tell the government what Roma wants? Question 1A. Why can't Czech politicians with their ample funding, assistance, and infrastructure agree amongst themselves and tell the European Union what Czechs want, including whether they want to be in the Union at all? Question 2. If their behavioral predispositions aren't genetically delineated, why are blacks so good at music and so unsuccessful in school? Question 2A. If Slavic behavioral predispositions aren't genetically delineated, why has their music regularly been characterized as unruly, formless, and emotional by German and Anglo-American writers? And why are East Europeans underrepresented in scientific citations? The question pairs could go on ad absurdum. I have mentioned the parallel with the project of whiteness studies, with which I identify as long as its divisions of people into more and less powerful ethnicities do not overshadow other relevant theoretical concerns. But at the same time, my idea of Gadjology also involves, paradoxically, ways of deracializing, or perhaps treading on dangerous ground, inadvertently re-racializing, interpretive theory and methodology. One premise of Gadjology is that a minority-centric perspective, which need not come from a minority author, can hold up an ethnographic mirror to society as a whole. I have tried to do this by applying certain frameworks, for example, work ethic, equivalently to more than one collectivity, without regard for previously established assumptions about racial characteristics, status, social dominance, and deviance, or interethnic difference. One way of effecting this process is to look at different groups that cut across each other like Venn diagrams, such as race and class, but also less studied and less ossified subgroup divisions like music students or music teachers. Borrowing here from sociology, one might consider mothers, the long-term unemployed, or politicians, rather than just taking supposedly homogeneous cultures as units of study. Examples of interpretive frameworks that can be taken out of their typical ethnicized context and applied equivalently to other sets of people include ideas about the authenticity of cultural products or about religious symbolism. In these two cases, the questions might be, is folk music a people's only possible traditional musical output? And is the Catholic Eucharist a form of ritual cannibalism? I didn't make that one up. I stole the cannibalism one. My argument is not that cultural differences do not exist, but that in many social contexts, interethnic differences are overemphasized, created virtually ex nihilo, or presented in a way that obscures analogous characteristics in the culture to which the deviant group is being compared, as well as differences within groups. The ultimate goal of Gadjology is to privilege the interpretation of fundamental sameness rather than difference across ethnic groups, using previously established conceptual standards as levelers. I aim to theorize cross-cultural sameness, not from a structuralist perspective, but rather in the tradition of my fellow Roma and anti-racist activists who counter what I call the dogma of difference by deploying arguments of interethnically shared good and bad values. Gadjology is aimed at increasing reflexivity on both or multiple sides of the interethnic dynamic. The internet news site of Romea, a joint Romani-Gadjo organization that also publishes the monthly periodical Romani, has recently upped its implicit demonstration of interethnic sameness by using terminology that is stereotypically applied to Roma, but with reference to corrupt politicians who abuse the system, or far-right extremist groups who cost taxpayers millions, criticizing aspects and or members of Romani society. By the same token, unlike some other American academics, I firmly believe that ethnography should not shy away from social pathologies and other deficits in minority groups where they actually exist. The point, again, is simply to show that human values and personality distributions, good, problematic, and foolish, are fundamentally the same across ethnic groups. Thank you.